Welcome to the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast, where Gauri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is David Forsythe, Product Documentation Manager at Mavenlink. Welcome to the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thank you.
Super. Yeah, I'm doing good. Doing good. Thank you. And once again, I appreciate the time you spent, or you're going to spend with us in this podcast. So let's straight away get into the context. I have gone through your profile, and there's a lot of experience you've gained over the years. So please introduce a little bit more about yourself and how long you've been doing documentation and how did you initially got into documentation, please?
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of lucky that technical writing has sort of been a confluence of all the things I really love to do. And I've been doing, from a very young age, which is, writing and making art. And, even teaching myself computer programming languages so I could do things like write my own ASCII or text-based adventure games. And we're talking DOS era here, if that tells you anything. But I fell into technical writing somewhat serendipitously about 20 years ago. I had just finished up my first college degree, and I was doing front-end web design and hawking high-end retail electronics to work my way through another round of college. And one evening, the CEO and founder of a small library automation company came into the store, and we started talking, and we hit it off right away. And he had been writing and maintaining all of his software's users manuals since the beginning, and keeping them up to date was eating up too much of his time. So when he found out I had a background in not only writing, but also computer science and graphic design, he pretty much offered me a job on the spot, which was great because, my dream had been to work in software for years. And so I was sort of in the right place at the right time. It was kind of like a huge lucky break, and I've been doing it and mostly loving it ever since. I will say that a lot has changed in 20 years. I came into the field at a transitional time, actually, when a lot of the technical writing content was physical, like printed manuals. And I started out building documentation in structured FrameMaker. And, as our software grew, the manuals also grew, and some of them were jumping from 200 to 600 pages. And I decided it was crazy to keep printing them. Every time the software updated, our entire backlog of manuals was instantly outdated. And sending people obsolete manuals was a poor customer experience. And throwing them out, all that paper out was costly and wasteful. So, even providing PDFs to people was problematic since you had no control over what versions people had tucked away on their machines. So I started to research and was able to build and implement our first online help center so that we could generate and maintain it using a simple markup language. And hopefully there's a grove of trees somewhere out there that's still alive thanks to me. So I don't know.
Fantastic. So that's a great experience, David. So I'm guessing you might have turned a lot of paper-based manuals into a computer-based material using some software. So in that sense, what was your documentation process, or what is your documentation process at Mavenlink, and who normally gets involved?
So it's not really a one size fits all. I'll lightly dust over the individual contributor processes like, interview, research, identify the audience, the medium, draft, review, and publish. I think those things are standards. There's givens for technical writers at any company. But at Mavenlink, I've really tried to emphasize the importance of words around a larger, more holistic team process that encompasses the entire customer journey and the product lifecycle. So because of this, our disciplines are pretty broad. And so our documentation process has changed depending on if we're developing content for new features, filling gaps in existing content, or fixing mistakes. And, we actually eat our own dog food and use the Mavenlink platform to manage documentation requests from internal employees. So people outside the product organization, everyone ranging from CSMs to sales to support, they can put in a request, and then we prioritize those requests accordingly and assign them to the appropriate writers. But for most of our core product documentation, which is generally our very top priority, we get involved at a very early stage, and everything starts with a product conception where we get context for the content being developed. After that, stories are written and assigned to a technical writer if a new feature needs anything from UX, UI copy, contextual help, in-app guides, API documentation, localization requirements, feature announcements, knowledge base articles, release notes, and so on. So from that point on, we attend daily and weekly meetings with the engineers and the designers, product managers, as the features are being developed. And I can say, without a doubt, that our inclusion in that process helps the product team build more intuitive software. I think it's because we approach everything through the eyes of a user. So we're often able to, ask questions during the process that help identify problems before they exist. And, add to the fact that we're constantly testing the app and checking how it works during development, in different staging accounts. If we're having a hard time explaining a workflow, it's often the design or the workflow and not the words that need to be improved. So, working closely with UX design on wireframes or prototype mocks really help us discover exactly how much text is needed in the interface to guide the user. And so, providing our feedback coming from a user perspective can really influence how a feature works or gets designed. And that's a big part of how we work with the product team. As a documentation team, we have a collaborative weekly review where we share what everyone's working on and provide feedback and constructive criticism. The more eyes we have on content, I think, leads to better quality documentation and in turn, a better user experience. So, all that being said, Mavenlink is the very epitome of the word agile. And so teams can work very differently one to another. Mm-hmm. And we often have to embrace that ambiguity and, that comes with constant change and look for ways to improve and adapt our processes, documentation wise as necessary.
Super. So I think my next question is, what are the important factors to consider when creating documentation? And you did mention more eyes on review gives you a better documentation. So what other important factors do you consider, David?
Without a doubt, I think the most important factor is consistency. Consistency in terminology, in tone, and voice is incredibly important. Although it depends on the audience, I think our writing tends to be conversational in nature. So if we were a person, we might be a teacher or a coach or a mentor, someone who's empathetic yet professional. And I sometimes tell my team to imagine that they're sitting down, walking a user through a workflow, and that user is their mother. And, your mileage may vary with that analogy depending on your relationship with your mother. But another factor for me is consistency in design, layout, the visual elements on the page. So it's important to consider the arrangement of text and images, being mindful to have line breaks that introduce white space and avoid giant walls of text. We use a style guide that spells out specific grammar mechanics and use cases, like such as bolding words that reference buttons or navigational labels in the interface. These sorts of things add visual anchors that make the content more skimmable and engaging. And screenshots also, screenshots are an art form in and of themselves. And I think most people do them wrong. I think good screenshots go a long way in helping a user navigate your product. And when they're properly staged, like with actual real data, they serve as a preview that demonstrates to a user or even a potential prospect what their environment could look like when properly implemented. I think in the end, you don't really get a second chance to make a first impression, and poor writing or careless spelling errors and grammatical mistakes, those kinds of things, they can quickly erode trust and create a really negative experience. If you're asking people to trust you with their sensitive information and you can't even spell the word sensitive correctly, it puts people off. So, once you lose a user's trust, it's really hard to gain it back. And when enough of these little flaws add up, it can potentially turn into a lost revenue stream.
True, very true, David. So now, after considering all these important factors and having a very structured process around documentation, have you seen any kind of reduction in your workload since introducing such quality documentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's mainly qualitative, right? But there's definitely been a reduction in workload, and not just for our clients. I see it a lot internally, where quality documentation acts as like a single source of truth that contains all of our company's tribal knowledge. So it helps new employees onboard and ramp up. I've had a number of new engineers tell me how useful they found the knowledge base when they were just starting out, and they were trying to figure out how some obscure area of the product worked, and they referenced the knowledge base and to figure that out. And I think it also helps more tenured employees quickly reference information they may have forgotten, it's also really not very uncommon these days to see CSMs in our professional services team respond to frequently asked questions in Slack just by providing a link to the knowledge base. Like that's someone asks a question, they just plop a link down, and then that's their answer. And our support team uses the knowledge base for case deflection, and our training team works knowledge base links into their training collateral for clients to reference later. So, quality documentation that is clear and concise and free of colloquialisms and idioms, like they make that's easier to translate when it's time for localization. So I think it clears out all the low-hanging fruit, and it gives our engineers and our support team the space they need, to solve the bigger issues and the higher priority items.
True. That's very true, David. And I remember you mentioning most of your documentation are public-facing one. So have you, is Mavenlink currently generating any organic search traffic from your knowledge base?
Yeah, I'd say, around 30% of all our traffic comes from organic search. So
any particular category or article you've that's caught your eyes in terms of generating this organic traffic?
Yeah, funnily enough, Gantt charts. So we have an integrated Gantt chart, and it gets a lot of organic traffic. And I think I've even heard, maybe this is secondhand, that someone said that our Gantt documentation was better than their own, and they would reference people to ours to figure out how to use it. So but I'd say that most of our trafficked articles come from areas in our app, where we provide contextual help links. I think more than anything, those, drive a ton of people to the knowledge base.
Super. So what do you mean by designing words, David?
So I mean that content isn't a Band-Aid. I think not all user UX or design problems can be fixed by bringing writers in at the end, and that writers should be involved during the early stages of conception and planning, as it can take a long time to roll out the perfect messages for each product. The earlier a writer is brought in, the better a product will be. And I think there's this idea that the UX, will design like an error message or something in the app, and that writers are brought in at the last minute to sort of put icing on the cake, so to speak. And I really do feel that writers should be helping bake the cake, because if a designer gives you, a space of 250 characters to put in a message, you may find out, that the user really requires something larger to accomplish their goals. And these days, I think words and content that writers create end up representing the face and the voice of your product. And, if you think about it, a writer ends up being one of only a handful of people who your customers really interact with during their product journey. So it's not enough to have really great content in just the knowledge base. You need to make sure that you are bringing that consistency of terminology and language and voice and tone across to the user interface, or anywhere there's a touch point or a potential client interaction. It just creates a better cohesive user experience. And if you don't pay as much attention to the words being used in the actual interface as you do, say, in your marketing content or in the knowledge base, it ends up creating this disconnect and sending a message, and probably not the message you want to communicate, which is, we don't care. So you might as well have intentional control of that message. And since someone has to be responsible for those words, it makes sense that the team who is creating the other documentation, for the sake of consistency of, of language, of tone and voice, are those people who are doing that. So designing with words is designing, with a conversation and an experience.
Fantastic. That's really great, David. So you helped us learn a little bit more today by explaining what designing words means. That's great. So let's quickly move on to rapid fire round now. Who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
I think the professors I had in college when I was getting my degree in design, they taught that any type of successful visual communication is really about like a marriage. It's a harmony between the design and the typography. So it's the merging of design and words. And one of my favorite exercises is to show people what like very popular user interfaces like Facebook or Amazon look like when they're stripped of words. So if you take away all the words, all the content, it's just a bunch of boxes with rounded corners for the most part. And like I said, it's worth saying, if there are no words, you've got no product. But honestly, I think when I think about it, I came into it, fairly early. There wasn't the blogs and the kind of sites available and these days. And I'm pretty much self-taught. So most everything I really needed to learn ended up coming from the user.
Nice. Great. Yeah. Super. So can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Recently, I've been consuming a lot of articles about how to build better products with UX writing, and how technical writing plays a critical role in product adoption. But although it's not recent, I'll kind of going on the theme here of UX and usability. I'll do something a little different and recommend a book by Steve Krug called "Don't Make Me Think," and he's a little too anti-words at times, but like I said, my goal is always to be concise, but you really need to have exactly as many words as are necessary to achieve for a user to achieve their goals. But I do think it's a good book to talk about, how to test things with users and see, how to make things more streamlined. And it's a good resource that you can easily equate into technical writing and documentation practices.
All right. So what is that one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
I'd say learn early how to more effectively communicate the value of technical writing to others, especially decision makers in your company. I think that not everybody sees or understands the value of technical writing. And I've spent a really good portion of my career trying to convince people why words matter. And, one of the reasons I think is because everybody writes, every day, but not everybody writes well. And, I once worked with a technical writer who was fond of saying that, bad writers don't know they're bad. So I think it's important to find your advocates and your natural allies in the company and have, and evangelize yourself and learn to communicate, and show your worth, because, if we're doing our jobs right, 99% of what we do is completely invisible. If there's no weird grammatical errors and everything reads well, people don't notice. But the minute you have like a weird spelling error or, a missing period, someone, will take note of that. So, I definitely say learn how to effectively communicate the value of technical writing.
Fantastic. That's great, David. So I think we are very close to our end of the episode. Would you like to add a few more words to the audience before we say bye to them?
No, I think I'm pretty good.
Okay.
I just think that, I said like there's a lot, in my brain from years of doing this, and there's so many different avenues and takes on what you can talk about documentation. But I really appreciate you having me, and I really love what you're doing. I think it's a great resource for people. I think, that advice I would give myself as a 20-year-old is sort of what you are doing here in this podcast, is you're sort of effectively communicating the value of what we do to the world. And I think it's such a great thing for that exposure. And I think that, technical writing is sort of in another transitional phase right now where it's growing. And I think more and more companies are really starting to see the value that it brings. I mean, it's more than just, it's sort of
like a mainstream, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like the writers play a big role in making your entire product better, and small subtle changes have such a big impact on customer satisfaction and engagement. And, those words are vital to get right because they can create long lasting, customers. And, it gives, good writing gives a company a competitive advantage, I think,
Yeah, totally agree, David. So that's really great. And I know you had lots to talk because it's just not few years of experience. It's a 20-year of writing experience. And you did start your career as a UX writer, and then a technical writer, and now a documentation product manager. So that's a great journey to have. So I think you've really condensed a lot of information in this 30 minutes. So thank you once again for the time you have spent with us today. And it was a great episode interviewing you, David.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.